He pulled it out of me and it pulsated with each beat. The blood was thick red and made it glisten. I can't believe that's been inside of me. You could see the veins. You could see blood pumping through the veins. He brought it close to my face so I could get a better look. I was in awe and in shock. He brought his hands together so they were next to each other, both pulsating but at different rhythms, slightly out of sync, mine smaller than his, like a model version of the real thing. I looked at his face briefly and then back. Suddenly nervous, I took his in my hand. I wanted to feel the same power he felt when holding it. Now I was holding his, and he was holding mine. I felt uneasy, not knowing what either one of us was going to do with the other. I couldn't push down the feelings of wanting to hurt his before he hurt mine. I felt so weak without it inside of me that I wanted to do something to feel in control again. I started to tighten my grip on it. I heard a squirm. I looked up at his face, staring intently at mine, willing me to stop. I loosened my hold and saw relief wash over his face. I smiled and took mine from his hand. Now I was holding both. I dropped his onto the floor and saw his whole body shudder in pain as it split open and blood started to pour out onto the floor. I shoved mine back inside of me. He pulled it out of me. It pulsed with each beat. It was thick with blood. It glistened.
I can't believe that's been inside me. I followed the patterns my veins made on the surface. You could see blood pumping through them. He reached inside himself and pulled his out too. Now he had one in each hand, hands side by side, both beating but at different rhythms, slightly out of sync, mine smaller than his, like a model version of the real thing. I looked at his face briefly and then back. Suddenly nervous, I took his in my hand. I wanted to feel the same power he felt when holding it. Now I was holding his, and he was holding mine. I felt uneasy, not knowing what either one of us was going to do with the others. I couldn't push down the feeling of wanting to hurt his before he hurt mine. I felt so weak without it inside of me. I wanted to do something to feel in control again. I started to tighten my grip on it. He let out a quick breath in pain. I looked up at his face, staring intently at me, willing me to stop. It felt good to have power over him. I loosened my hold and saw relief wash over his face. I smiled and took mine from his hand. Now I was holding both. I threw his onto the floor, watched his body shudder in pain as it split open. Blood started to seep out onto the wooden floor. I walked away and carefully put mine back inside myself. He pulled it out of me. I watched it pulse with each beat. The smell of my blood filled the room. It felt empty where it had previously been, collapsing in on itself. I can't believe that's been inside of me. I studied the veins on it, where the large tube comes out the top and takes blood to the rest of my body.
It looked soft, like it could easily be damaged. He reached inside himself and took his out too. Now he had one in each hand, hands side by side, both beating but at different rhythms. Slightly out of sync, mine smaller than his, like a model version of the real thing. I looked at his face while he stared at what was in his hands. I touched his and it felt sturdier, more muscly than I thought. I wiped the blood off of my hands onto his chest. Suddenly nervous, I took his from his hand. I wanted to feel in control again, to feel the same power he felt when holding them. I felt uneasy, not knowing what either one of us was going to do with the others. I couldn't push down the feeling of wanting to hurt his before he hurt mine. I started to squeeze it, and he begged me to stop. But he was still holding mine. I squeezed harder until it burst in my hand. He fell to the floor. His blood spurted onto the both of us. I dropped it, knelt down beside him, took mine from his hand and put it back inside me. He pulls it out of me. It pulses with each beat. The sight of the blood makes me feel weak. I say, I can't believe that's been inside of me. I watch the blood pump through the veins.
He reaches inside himself and pulls his out, holding them side by side. I notice that mine is smaller than his. They both pulse at different rhythms, slightly out of sync, mine smaller than his, like a model version of the real thing. I feel uneasy and take his in my hand. I feel in control again. I regain power. I feel like I can't push down the feelings of wanting to hurt his before he hurt mine. I start to tighten my grip on it. I watch his face for a reaction. I feel weak. I feel like I have stones in my chest. He is squeezing mine. I watch mine turning blue. I release my grip on his. He stops squeezing mine.
We stare at each other, wonder what to do next. He offers mine back to me. I tentatively reach out to take a hold of it. He pulls back and looks at his in my hand. I realize he wants to exchange. I offer his back to him. We swap at the same moment. I put mine back inside myself. I pulled it out of her.
It was covered in her blood. Thick, red, hot blood. I can't believe that's been inside of me, she said. I was surprised that she's never seen one before. I watched her staring at it in my hands. She looked both amazed by it and in shock. It felt good to be holding it. Like she was proud of me that I held it so still so she could look at it. I reached into myself and took mine out too. I held both in front of her so she could study them. Mine was bigger than hers. They beat at different rhythms, unable to be in time with one another. I felt uneasy, unsure of what I was supposed to do now, unsure of what she wanted to do. She looked up and smiled at me. I noticed we were both covered in her blood. She took mine from my hand. I felt calm. We were both holding each other's. Suddenly she started to squeeze it. I felt panicked, like I couldn't breathe. She loosened her grip and smiled at me, took hers from my other hands, remnants of blood left on my skin. I felt a tight pain in my chest, heavy and pulling me down, like I was collapsing from the inside, my body caving in on itself. It lay next to me, blood pouring out onto the wooden floor. I got a tight grip of it and pulled it out of her. I felt powerful with it in my hand, her blood on both of us, making it glisten thick and gloopy. It filled this empty room. I can't believe that's been inside of me, she said as she stared at it in my hand. She seemed weak without it inside of her. Like now she was properly mine. I could do what I wanted with it, with her.
I suddenly felt pity. She was helpless. She had never done this before. I started to squeeze it in my hand, digging my nails into the muscle, bursting, collapsing. She pulled it out of me, cupped it in her hands, rocking it like a baby. She knelt down in the grass and placed it on the ground. I can't believe that's been inside of me. She reached inside herself and took hers out, placed it next to mine, blades of grass collapsing from the weight, with those around standing upright like a wall. Blood staining her hands red, wiping on the top of her thighs, a handprint in our blood. I took her hand and picked up hers. She picked up mine. We carried them to the stream. We took off our shoes and climbed in, submerged, head only out the water. We let them go to sink to the bottom. He pulled it out of me and it pulsated with each beat. The blood was thick red and made it glisten. I can't believe it's been inside of me. You could see the veins. You could see the blood pumping through the veins. I felt uneasy not knowing what he was going to do with it. I wanted to feel the power he felt when holding it. I felt weak without it inside of me, like my body was going to cave in from the inside. He started to tighten his grip on it, his expression focused on his action. My body shook in pain, blood poured out onto the wooden floor. He pulled it out of her and it pulsated with each beat. They lay facing one another, bodies almost touching. I could smell the blood from where I was stood. He stared at her while she studied it in his hand. I can't believe it's been inside of me, she said. He took it out. He took his out too and held both in front of her for her to see.
They beat at different rhythms, slightly out of sync from one another. She took his from his hand. I felt uncomfortable watching. He pulled it out of her and it pulsated with each beat. They lay facing one another, bodies almost touching. I could smell the blood from where I was stood. He stared at her while she studied it in his hand. I can't believe that's been inside of me, she said. He took his out too, and held both in front of her for her to see. They beat at different rhythms, slightly out of sync from one another. She took his from his hand. I felt uncomfortable watching. She started to squeeze it and his expression changed. He looked in pain, like he was willing her to stop. She stopped and smiled at him, took hers from his hand, so she was holding both. They both looked relaxed and at ease. She threw his onto the ground. I watched his body shudder in pain as it split open. Blood started to seep out. She put hers back inside her and walked away. She pulled out of herself, covered in thick red blood. I can't believe that's been inside of you, she said as she gave it over to her. She held it in her hands.
Hands fit perfectly around it. She watched her hold it. Feeling uneasy now that she had given over her power, she felt weak without it inside of her. She needed to do something to feel in control again, reaching into her, pulling hers out. Now they were holding each other's. Her action shocked her, but she couldn't push down the feeling of wanting to hurt her. She squeezed it in her hand, dug her nails in like claws, piercing the flesh, the muscle, the blood started to squirt out over them both. She watched her fall to the floor. I met him at a friend's birthday party, who was more than a foot taller than me. I thought that we must look odd standing next to each other. He took me to a spare room in the house. The music moved up the walls, through the floor, into my body from my feet, the bass thudding in my heartbeat in time. I pointed out where I kept it so he could trace the outline of it on my skin. I hadn't told anyone before I kept it, or that I even had it. I liked carrying it around with me, with only myself aware of it, no one else knowing, on the inside where they can't see. On that first night, he asked if he could see it. I told him that it wasn't for anyone else to see.
On the second night, he asked if he could see it again. He said he didn't even want to touch it, he just wanted to see what it looked like. I repeated that it wasn't for anyone else to see or touch, that it was just for me. As time passed, he became more obsessed with it, with wanting to see it, and then wanting to touch it, to hold it. I would catch him staring at my skin where I first told him it was, like my skin was the only barrier between himself and it, a mere inconvenience in the way. He would stop mid-sentence, mid-fuck, and ask me again why I wouldn't show anyone. Why did I have to keep it all to myself? He asked if he married me, would I share it with him? Would I let him see it, touch it, hold it? I screamed no, it wasn't for anyone else, it was just for me, underneath my flesh. This angered him so much that he reached inside and pulled it out of me. I put mine back inside me and walked out of the room. I felt strong again, powerful and in control. I wondered how long it would take someone to find him.
I guessed pretty quickly because there were other people in the house. I decided I should probably leave soon because it would cause a lot of chaos once they found him, and I didn't really want to get mixed up in that. I started out of the house, walking to the bus stop. She pulled it out of him, blood leaking out the crack in his skin, a hole that she had made. She held it in her hands, not knowing what to do with it. She lay on the bed, looking at the blinds in front of the windows. She watched them get smaller and larger in the dark. It scared her when she saw this. Her mind would go dull and quiet, but so loud she couldn't hear anything, and the blinds would move. I can't believe that's been inside of me. She jumped at the sound of his voice.
He asked what was wrong. She told him he had startled her. He said he hadn't said anything. She lay back down to look at the blinds, but now they were no longer moving. She couldn't play the game with her eyes anymore. She put it down on the bed. What was the point? He pulled it out of her. She didn't respond or move. He had done this so many times before, on the floor of their grandmother's bedroom, behind the sofa, in the tree behind the shed, in his sister's room. Neither of them wanted to startle. She didn't want her to notice. He came to her house. She sat on her bed. He sat in the chair. She doesn't remember what he said. She only knows that it made her cry. She hadn't realised that he had noticed her over time. He asked if he could have it. She said yes. He pulled it out of her. He pulled it out of her and said he was going to jump into the river with it if she didn't follow him.
She stood behind the railing facing the river. He climbed over it, his feet on the edge, leaning backwards. They were facing each other, with him 10 feet from the ground. She closed her eyes, thinking about what to do, and when she knew, she opened them. He was no longer there. He pulled it out of her. I can't believe it's been inside of me, she thought. Looking at it, covered in her blood, made her feel ill. She started to vomit on herself. She was too weak to stand up. It came out of the sides of her mouth, down her cheek. He stood above her, looking down on her. He told her to take his out because he had taken hers. She hesitated. He told her she didn't have an option, that this was only fair. She complied and took his out. She made sure to reach around inside, stay in there for longer, so it was more painful for him. He grabbed it out of her hands, sat down, back against the wall, knees up, staring at it in his hands. She asked if she could have hers back, but she wasn't sure if she wanted it now that he had touched it. It wouldn't be the same to give to anyone else. It wouldn't be like it used to be. He said it didn't belong to her now.